of people. Again, you know, this just shows you how these social categories are very fluid and can change over time. Skipping this, let's bring it even closer to home and look at the racial and ethnic classifications used at the University of California for its admissions. From 1995 to 2005, we used just this 7 or 8 categories. These are the terms that were used and the order in which they were given. In 2005, the admissions form started to acknowledge pressures for diversity on the University of California campuses by making accommodations for not just East Indians and Filipinos and Japanese and Koreans and Chinese, but also other Asians and also other Spanish American or Latino folks. That lasted until 2009. And now, this is what happens when you fill out the University of California admissions form. You have to find yourself in this list of categories because there's a student-driven campaign called the Count Me In campaign. We want everybody counted, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. The point is, there's nothing natural about any of these categorizations. These are categorizations that are socially driven. They are socially constructed. They change with the nature of the society. They're a moving target, okay? And they're a moving target because the society itself is a moving target. Okay. Let's go back to some more or less technical cognitive science here for a second and just remind you that it's one thing to try to identify what the categories are. It's another thing to look at what the cognitive structure of these social categories are. And again, in the history of cognitive psychology and cognitive science, we can trace an evolution of our theories of categorization that goes somewhat as follows. From the time of Aristotle, 400 or 500 BC, until very recently, roughly 1960, our ideas about categorization were dominated by an Aristotelian view of categories as proper sets. This is known as the classical view of categories. And the idea here is that every category is identified by a set of features that are singly necessary and jointly sufficient to define membership in the category. So to use an example from last Monday, fish are cold-blooded vertebrates with skins, with scales and fins. All fish have those 4 properties. If you've got those 4 properties, you're a fish. Okay? If you don't have those 4 properties, you're not a fish. Anything, there's kind of no in between. Okay? So that's the classical view. That view began to break down in the 1950s among philosophers, and especially after in the 1970s, with the work of Berkeley's own Eleanor Rosch, who single-handedly, with just paper and pencil, smashed 2,500 years of received wisdom about the nature of categories. A really unbelievably singular intellectual achievement, and left us with what's now known as the probabilistic view of categories, which says that there's no perfect association between some package of defining features and category membership. Rather, the features that we use to identify categories have only a probabilistic relationship to category membership. It's not the case, and if you look at how we mentally represent categories, it's not the case that the features we think of as important to category membership are present in every instance of the category. They just tend to be more present within the category than outside the category. The probabilistic view associated with Professor Rosch has been challenged in some quarters by what's known as an exemplar view, which basically says that what we carry around in our heads is not a list of characteristic features or even a list of defining features, but rather what we carry around in our heads is a list of category members. And when we want to assign objects to a category, we compare them to category members, not to some abstract list. And then more recently, the probabilistic view and the exemplar view have been challenged by a view of concepts as theories, which basically says that we don't have anything like a list of features or a list of exemplars in our heads. What we have is kind of a theory that relates various features to various category membership. Okay? So if you take a cognitive psychology course, which most of you have, or take a cognitive science course, you get this kind of history, and you know that the classical view is not empirically supported, but that people tend to favor one or the other of these more revisionist views. What's interesting is that you can see exactly this same kind of history repeat itself with respect to social categorization. Here is one very good example. Okay. The classical fourfold typology that comes to us from Kant, Immanuel Kant, actually wrote a psychology text. Okay, really good, actually a pretty good book, in which he divided people into 4 types: melancholics, cholerics, sanguines, and phlegmatics. Melancholics are kind of depressive types, cholerics are kind of angry types, sanguine people are easygoing, and phlegmatic people are just kind of slow to get moving. Don't care too much about anything. And what Kant argued, basically following on Hippocrates and Galen, Greek and Roman founders of medicine, is that the whole world could be classified into these 4 types of people based on their features. I won't read this to you. There's Kant's description of the sanguine temperament: carefree and full of hope. Melancholic, okay, discover everywhere cause for anxiety. Notice the difficulties first. Choleric temperament: hot-headed, okay, and phlegmatic, lacking emotion. Not laziness, just lacking emotion. Now, what happens when you try to apply this classification scheme, which looks kind of good at the outset, after all, it too lasted roughly 2,000 years, is that you find problems of partial expression and combined expression, which is to say there are people who just don't fit the category. They fall through the cracks somehow. There are some people who are anxious and worried, but they're also high-principled and controlled. You don't know whether to classify them as phlegmatic or as melancholic. This problem of partial and combined expression among personality types is exactly the problem we have in natural categorization, where we say, well, something's a typical car, but or not a typical automobile, or whatever. So the problem is how to solve this. Well, one way to solve this, a solution proposed by Wilhelm Wundt, one of the pioneering psychologists in the 19th century, is to take this categorical scheme, which says there are 4 different kinds of people: cholerics and melancholics, or sanguines, or phlegmatics, and to turn that 4 category scheme into a 2-dimensional scheme in which people vary along 2 different continua. First, a continuum of strength of emotion. Melancholics and cholerics have very strong emotional states. Phlegmatics and sanguines have very weak emotional states, and also a dimension of speed of emotional arousal. Cholerics and sanguines change their mood very quickly. Sanguines don't have much mood to change, but when they do change their mood, they change very quickly, whereas melancholics and phlegmatics are very slow to change. And Wundt, who appreciated this problem in the late 19th century, said you get away from all the problems of trying to fit people into categories by getting rid of categories. Okay, you just turn your category scheme into 2 continuous dimensions, and now what we can do is we can take individuals, and instead of locating each individual in some discrete category, what we can do is locate each individual as a point in a 2-dimensional space, depending on how changeable your emotions are, and how strong your emotions are. This is a variant on Rosh's probabilistic view of categorization, which Wundt intuited in the late 19th century. So again, the point of this is that you can see in the social domain the same kinds of difficulties with the classical view of categorization that we find in the non-social domain, and this Wundtian idea of getting rid of categories and turning them into dimensions was one approach to this. Okay, you've got this two-dimensional space now where people are held to vary in terms of strength of emotional response and speed of emotional response. And what that means is that there's a prototypical, somewhere out there, there's a prototypical melancholic person who really does have all these traits to the extreme. He's worried and anxious and unhappy and suspicious and serious and thoughtful, and so you locate that person out here someplace. Here's a kind of prototypical sanguine individual. You'd be located out here someplace, very far from these kinds of boundaries. But other people could fall in between. They could have some features of melancholia, but some features of sanguinicity, whatever it is. So you can mix and match your categories. And you have to do that because people mix and match. The reason the classical fourfold scheme began to fall is that it didn't fit the actual empirical facts about people's personalities. Here's another example. Okay, psychiatric diagnosis is another way of categorizing people. A patient comes to a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist and says, I'm having difficulties. The first thing you do in the medical model of mental health services delivery is make a diagnosis. Okay, and when we make psychiatric diagnoses, what we're essentially doing is classifying the person as similar to some kinds of patients and different from other kinds of patients. So we say, well, your problem is you're schizophrenic, or your problem is you're depressed. Now, sometimes we say the problem is you have schizophrenia. But that very quickly slips over into a kind of typological idea where you say, well, you go home and your husband says, what patients did you see today? And you say, well, I saw another typical schizophrenic. You classify people in terms of personality types. Here is one view of the various major categories of mental illness. We make a distinction first between those who are normal and those who are mentally disturbed, and then we try to subclassify them in terms of the form of mental disturbance they have, whether they have an organic brain syndrome or mental retardation, or they're neurotic or psychotic or whatever. This is just another way of classifying people. And the question is, how do we do it? How do people in the mental health field classify people according to the various categories of mental illness? Again, the point here is that making a psychiatric diagnosis is an act of classification. You're classifying a person in the same way that you would if you called him a Hindu or a Christian or a neurotic or an extrovert or whatever. These are, again, social labels. And the symptoms that the patient presents are kind of like features, and the syndromes, schizophrenia, what have you, are categories. And we make psychiatric diagnosis by matching the symptoms that the patient presents to us to the symptoms that are known to be characteristic of various psychiatric diagnoses, and the rules for that are basically laid out in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, known as the DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association. If you've been reading the newspaper, you know that this is currently undergoing revision in very interesting ways. Okay, what's interesting about this is that the beginnings of psychiatry, the very beginnings of psychiatric diagnosis, from the late 19th century well up into the middle of the 20th century, the psychiatric diagnoses were construed as proper sets in the same way that Aristotle construed categories as proper sets, where the symptoms of mental illness were treated as defining features, and what you did was you tried to match the patient's symptoms to the various diagnostic categories. So, for example, the first thing you would want to do then is classify the patient as organic versus functional. Organic mental illnesses are associated with objective evidence of brain insult, injury, or disease. In functional mental illnesses, there's no evidence of brain damage. Then you classify the person as psychotic versus neurotic. Psychotic if there's a problem in reality testing, neurotic if there's a lot of anxiety. And then suppose you classify the person as psychotic, the next decision you have to make is whether the person is schizophrenic versus manic depressive, and that's based basically on whether the patient's symptoms are cognitive in nature or emotional in nature. Eugen Bleuler, the Swiss psychiatrist who first named schizophrenia as a form of mental illness, argued that all schizophrenics had four features in common, what he called the four A's: association disturbance, a particular kind of thought disorder; anhedonia, not too much positive emotion; autism, by which he meant social withdrawal; and ambivalence, meaning that there were certain problems in motivation. But Bleuler claimed that every schizophrenic patient showed the four A's, and if you showed the four A's, you were schizophrenic. The four A's were singly necessary and jointly sufficient to define the category of schizophrenia. That's exactly the way Aristotle defined categories back in the 5th century BC. The only problem with this is that as people started diagnosing schizophrenia, they quickly realized that thinking about psychiatric diagnoses as proper sets was no more satisfactory than thinking about personality types as proper sets. There were people who didn't fit, and there were a lot of people who didn't fit. There were people who had features of schizophrenia and features of manic depressive illness. That's not supposed to happen. Remember, according to the classical view, you're either in one category or the other. You can't be both a fish and a bird. Okay? You can't be both schizophrenic and manic depressive. And there were people who had some features of schizophrenia, but not all the features of schizophrenia. And there was a lot to do about exactly what to do about this. Okay? But there's the idea. Okay, once you've identified somebody as schizophrenic, then there were four subcategories of schizophrenia. Simple schizophrenia, if all you had was the four A's. Hebephrenic schizophrenic, try that one sometime. If you had displayed childlike behavior. Catatonic schizophrenia, if you assumed really strange postures. And paranoid schizophrenia, if you had delusions. It's a scheme of hierarchical classification that goes from superordinate category to subordinate category by adding new defining features at every stage. It makes a tremendous amount of sense on paper, and it simply doesn't work. Okay? So again, here's the hierarchical organization of psychopathology. Again, all classified in terms of proper sets. What happened in 1994 was that these problems with the diagnostic system, which stemmed entirely from the fact that the diagnostic categories were construed in classical terms as proper sets, was abandoned. Okay? And what the American Psychiatric Association did was essentially adopt, well, they didn't give her credit, essentially adopt a Roschian view of classification, in which now the various syndromes of mental illness are no longer identified in terms of defining features, which must be present, but rather in terms of characteristic features, which tend to be present. So now we can classify somebody as schizophrenic if they have either something in category 1, or something in category 2, or something in category 3. So if you have delusions and catatonia, okay. If you have flat affect and incoherence, okay. If you have bizarre delusions but no catatonia or hallucinations, you're still schizophrenic. If you have hallucinations but no catatonia or delusions, again, what's happening here is that for the first time, beginning in 1994, was a recognition that not all schizophrenic patients were the same. They cluster into this category, but they're not all alike with respect to any set of singly necessary and jointly sufficient defining features. Okay, so now, again, you can be diagnosed with schizophrenia if you have any two of these. So there's a lot of heterogeneity within the category of schizophrenia. And that's true for all the psychiatric diagnoses now. So here, with respect to psychiatric diagnosis, we have a problem of social categorization, how to take the patient in front of you and classify him or her. And we've seen in the history of psychiatric diagnosis a retracing of the steps of the evolution of models of categorization from thinking about psychiatric diagnoses as proper sets to thinking about psychiatric diagnoses as fuzzy sets or something like that. Okay, that's that history. What we'll do on Monday is we're going to take a close look at a particular form of social categorization known as stereotyping. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.